Hello and welcome to the 2021 Reuters Memorial Lecture. My name is Rasmus Kleis Nielsen. I'm Director of the Reuters Institute and Professor of Political Communication at the University of Oxford. I'm delighted to present to you today Patrícia Campos Mello, our lecturer this year. The Reuters Memorial Lecture is hosted every year by the Institute here in Oxford. Our mission is to explore the future of journalism worldwide through debate, engagement, and research. And the Memorial Lecture is our single most important public lecture every year. Today, Patrícia is following previous speakers who've given the lecture, including Marty Baron, Hushu Lee, Siddharth Varadarajan, and many other inspiring journalism editors from all over the world. We'll start today with Patrícia's lecture. Then Alan Rusbridger, the chair of our steering committee and former editor-in-chief of The Guardian here in the UK, will start the conversation with a few questions before we move on to a Q&A session where I'll ask all the participants who are joining us here in the Zoom to use the Q&A function to submit their questions. We'll start there with questions from the amazing group of Reuters Institute Journalist Fellows that we have the privilege of hosting here in Oxford. An amazing group of 15 outstanding journalists from 13 different countries all over the world hosted here on the fellowship program led by our Deputy Director, Mira Selda. Briefly about Patrícia, our speaker, I should just say that she's a news reporter. I know a few finer things to be than that. But I might add that she works at Folha de Sao Paulo, where she's also a columnist. She's won numerous awards for her important work, including the International Press Freedom Award from the Committee to Protect Journalists in 2019. And in the last year, she's perhaps particularly well known for her investigations of Brazil's handling of the COVID pandemic, as well as of Bolsonaro's presidential campaign, including its uses and abuses of social media and messaging applications. And recently, her coverage of the seemingly arbitrary, inconsistent, and lenient ways in which Facebook has enforced its community standards and misinformation policies when it comes to the president of one of the company's largest markets. Patrícia's important reporting has helped inform the public on some of the biggest issues of the day. It's also resulted in vicious abuse online and offline, including from the president, his son, and some of their supporters, even as it won her the admiration and gratitude of many Brazilians and journalists across the world. Today, she will speak under the title of How to Rescue Journalism in the Age of Lies, a challenge she and her colleagues face in Brazil, that journalists face across the world, and where we know that everyone has much to learn from Patrícia's example and from her experience. Patrícia, we're delighted to have you. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Rasmus. This is a huge honor and responsibility. I thank you for this opportunity. Well, good afternoon, everyone. At this exact moment, millions of Brazilians are getting most of their information about COVID-19 through Facebook, Telegram, YouTube, and WhatsApp. They are learning how to cure and prevent this deadly disease with hydroxychloroquine, vitamins, and ivermectin, a medication that combats lice. As science has shown, none of that works against the coronavirus. The Brazilian president, Jair Bolsonaro, and his main allies tell these same people every single day that there's no need to do social distancing, that masks are for sissies, that people should stop whining and get back to work. After all, his reasoning goes, if my economy sinks, my administration goes under. We know where all this leads. Over 470,000 Brazilians died of COVID-19. It's the second highest death toll in the world after the United States. And no, Brazil is not the second most populous country in the world, it's the sixth. At this precise moment, millions of Brazilians are also getting most of their information about next year's presidential election through Facebook, Telegram, WhatsApp, and YouTube. They're learning that the last elections in Brazil were rigged, that there was widespread ballot fraud, that electronic voting machines can easily be hacked. Since Brazil implemented electronic voting in 1996, there has never been any credible evidence of significant fraud in elections, not once. And yet, Bolsonaro, his main allies, and extreme right-wing bloggers tell these same people, day in and day out, that the 2022 presidential elections will be rigged unless an amendment to Constitution is approved and all the electronic voting machines are equipped with printers that guarantee a paper trail. There's nothing wrong with discussing ways to improve the security of voting. However, even if there were changes in legislation, there's not enough time to adapt all the voting machines by the 2022 election. And Bolsonaro has repeatedly said that the only reason he will lose is because of fraud with electronic voting. He is preemptively disputing the results in case he loses. We know where all that leads. In the US, after massive disinformation campaign led by former President Donald Trump, his supporters invaded the Capitol on January 6, 2021, to confront lawmakers and protest against the results, and 5 people died. According to recent polls, 60% of Republican voters believe there was widespread fraud and Joe Biden is not the legitimate president of the United States, even though dozens of judicial rulings stated the opposite. Today, the US is a fractured country, but it has managed to survive a massive attack against its institutions. I'm not sure whether a young democracy like Brazil will be able to resist these massive attacks against its electoral integrity and democratic institutions. Lies are the foundation of the health tragedy we're going through right now. And lies are the cornerstone of our incoming political disaster. Professional journalism is one of the last barriers against the collapse of democracy in Brazil and in many other countries struggling with an avalanche of lies. Meticulously checked information, careful and balanced reporting, and in-depth investigations are the only hope to bring back reality to many countries where fact became malleable and often secondary to opinions and beliefs. That is why journalists and media outlets are under attack in so many countries. Attacking professional media and discrediting journalists is part of the strategy of populist leaders to establish a direct channel with supporters, with no fact-checking, no questioning, and no accountability. With the help of social networks and pliant traditional media, these leaders are trying to bypass the filter of critical and independent journalism. Censorship in this new world does not require the suppression of information. On the one hand, populist leaders flood social media, messaging apps, and the internet in general with the version of facts they want to prevail, so that it drowns out investigations and negative news. It's the so-called censorship by noise. Then, for that manipulation of public opinion to succeed, these digital populists need to delegitimize professional journalism. To neutralize journalism, leaders deploy virtual militias that engage in character assassination and defamation campaigns against journalists and media outlets that keep the government in check. It's a new form of censorship, outsourced to trolls, bloggers, and influencers, amplified by bots and cyborgs on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp, Telegram, YouTube. And it is embraced by real people, eager to see their beliefs validated. These aggressions have nothing to do with fair and welcome criticism. Journalists make mistakes, and we should correct them, and we should be accountable for them. Nor is it the traditional animosity between governments and watchdogs. This is something different. To be a journalist in Brazil today is to be the target of a hate machine. The Brazilian president has already told more than one journalist to shut up. Once, he told a reporter that he had, and I quote, the terrible look of a homosexual. A few months ago, asked by a reporter about a corruption investigation, He said he wanted to punch him in the mouth. These aggressions are widely shared on social media, part of an offensive to portray the media as the enemy of the people and inflame the population against journalists. The same is happening in the Philippines, India, Hungary, Turkey, in the US, and many other countries. Sadly, it works. The main media outlets in Brazil no longer send journalists to cover the impromptu press briefings of the president outside Alvorada Palace in Brasilia because it is not safe. Reporters were constantly threatened by government supporters who yelled things like rats, rotten press, fake news, communists. It got to the point that last May, a photojournalist got pushed, kicked, and punched in the stomach during a protest in favor of the government and the closing of Congress and the Supreme Court. On top of the digital onslaught, the government resorts to the National Security Act to silence critical journalists, scholars, political cartoonists, and the opposition. The National Security Act is a rarely used piece of legislation and a remnant of the military dictatorship. Journalists are also under systematic judicial harassment, being sued by the president's supporters demanding huge sums. Media outlets are targets as well. The president himself and his ministers put pressure in private and on social media on businesses to stop advertising in critical news organizations and on TV. The situation is especially critical for female journalists. We are the target of defamation campaigns stimulated and amplified by the government. Much more frequently than our male colleagues, we have our parents and our children intimidated, our appearance mocked, our addresses and phone numbers exposed, and we are subject to violent threats both online and in the real world. I have been the target of this hate machine since 2018, when I started writing about the political use of WhatsApp and other disinformation tools to manipulate public opinion. In the beginning, I got threatening messages on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. In one of those messages on Facebook, a guy said, "If you want your son to be safe, leave the country. This is not a threat, it's a warning." My son was 6. Trolls then started sending messages to WhatsApp groups of Bolsonaro supporters, telling them the address, date, and time of the events I would participate in. They urged Bolsonaro followers to go to the conferences and confront me. They started to call my cell phone. "You were a communist slut. I'm heading to your house now to punch you in the face." We gathered the most extreme threats and sent them to the police. The newspaper decided I should have a bodyguard for a while, just in case. I covered the conflicts in Libya, Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan, and I never considered hiring a security consultant. I was in São Paulo, my hometown, covering the elections, and I needed a bodyguard. In February last year, the hate machine started a massive online sexual harassment campaign. Thousands of memes have circulated on the internet in which my face appears in pornographic montages, calling me a prostitute and alluding to sexual organs. I get messages from people saying that I offer sex in exchange for scoops and that I should be raped. I recently won lawsuits for moral damages against President Bolsonaro and his son, Eduardo Bolsonaro, a lawmaker, for repeatedly stating or implying that I offer sex in exchange for scoops. They are appealing the verdict. I am not alone. Many respected female journalists in Brazil, like Miriam Leitão, Vera Magalhães, Thalita Fernandes, Constança Rezende, Juliana Dalpiva, Daniela Lima, and many others, have also been the target of misogynistic attacks. And around the world, great journalists like Maria Ressa in the Philippines and Neha Dixit in India are being attacked with sexist slurs and threats just because they're doing their jobs. Amid these intimidation campaigns, it is tempting for us, journalists, to see the government as the enemy. But that is precisely what we should not do. We should fight intimidation with our best weapon, fair and balanced reporting. The pandemic and the rise of authoritarian leaders around the world have shown that journalism is necessary. In the middle of a health disaster and an avalanche of disinformation, accurate information is precious. Reporters are the ones going to hospitals to show what the situation is there. We are the ones revealing that ICUs are running out of oxygen and pain medication necessary to intubate patients. We obtained diplomatic cables showing how the government mobilized its structure to import unproven medicines against COVID-19 and neglected vaccines. Journalists are parsing budgets and exposing how the government is cutting funding for combating deforestation and is tolerating massive operations of illegal logging, while telling the world that it is defending the Amazon. Fact checkers are the ones verifying claims that could lead people to dangerous behavior regarding their health or democracy. Who else is going to do that? Not opinion writers, partisan bloggers, activists, digital influencers, or government officials, just journalists. We also can't rely on the owners of the modern public square, the internet platforms, to prevent disinformation from creating or exacerbating health and political crisis. We have seen how they enforce their own rules arbitrarily. Professional journalists are the ones who are capable of uncovering the truth and getting it out there. It won't be easy because we face unfair competition. Disinformation goes viral. Accurate information does not. Still, we have an invaluable opportunity to prove the relevance of journalism in a world of lies. How can we do that? First, we shouldn't mix journalism with activism. We can't take sides, even when what we see is outrageous and it's causing a massive number of preventable deaths. But we don't need to take sides. It's not necessary to tell people how we feel or what they should think. Simply showing evidence, exposing hidden information, finding original documents, and getting to primary sources, carefully investigating in order not to make mistakes, and correcting errors. That is the best we can do to try to make quality information reach people. That's how we can fight injustice without compromising journalistic values. With luck, our newly regained relevance will help us break the shell of some of the people who became impervious to news that does not endorse their beliefs or political leanings. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Patrícia. That was a very sobering and telling lecture, and all the more powerful because built on your own experience as a reporter. Please, if you're in the audience, there's a Q&A panel down at the bottom of the screen, so I can see some questions arriving already, and I'll come to other questions in a second. But Patrícia, let me start. I mean, you begin by drawing a lot of comparisons with America, and they're eerie in the similarities about undermining the electoral process itself and the press, and describing the press as the enemy of the people. I suppose most people would think that, given the general crisis in journalism generally, the American press came out quite well from the Trump era. They proved their worth, they proved their resilience, and in some cases they actually prospered commercially, as people did turn to the press as the one bit of the balance of powers that was working. Can you just talk a bit more about what the parallel is in Brazil?
Thank you, Alan, for your question. I think there are many parallels. I mean, since the beginning, President Bolsonaro said repeatedly that he saw former President Trump as the role model. I mean, it got to the point that a week after former President Trump canceled the subscriptions for the New York Times and other critical media outlets, the Brazilian president canceled subscriptions for Folha and other newspapers. So he never tried to hide that he had President Trump as a model. And I do think that Brazilian press, just like the American press, they did actually well maintaining its independence during the pandemic and in spite of the constant attacks of the president. I think in the case of American media, after making some big mistakes during the 2016 elections, they did correct course, as did Brazil. Brazilian media did make some very serious mistakes during the corruption investigations that became known as the car wash operation. And faced with a government that is increasingly authoritarian, newspapers and TV have managed to maintain their independence. However, I'm not sure about the financial health. I understand that in the US, the New York Times and many TV stations, they gained a lot of advertisers or subscribers. And in Brazil, I'm not sure that is happening because we're still facing a very deep recession. And on top of all, what really makes me nervous is, it's interesting, when I first met Maria Ressa, that was in 2018. And at that time, we were talking about the similarities between Duterte in the Philippines and Bolsonaro, who had just been elected in Brazil. And I said, well, we're worried because the president just announced he's going to cut all government advertising in critical media outlets. And she said, well, wait until he starts to put pressure on private advertisers. And she was right. That is what's happening now. It's been happening for a few months. So at the same time, I do think that we gained relevance and we might have gained subscribers, but the recession is very bad and there's a concerted effort from the government to attack revenue sources of media outlets.
You've been critical, of course, of the social media platforms, but you yourself are very active on Twitter and you've got a huge following. Tell me why you can't stay away from Twitter. I mean, tell me why it's essential for what you do.
That's an excellent question. Well, I am very active on Twitter. However, I do not express any personal opinions or thoughts because I am a reporter. I don't think that like all the journalists should abstain from doing this, but I think that if you're a reporter covering some issues, you should try not to make your opinions known. And I do think it is essential because that's a very valuable tool to get information. I mean, you were just monitoring real time primary sources of all kinds of information. Of course, we have to be very careful, you know, and check. But it is very important to obtain information.
And can you talk a bit about in countries where press freedom is under attack and the ability of voices to be heard is threatened? Again, what could be lost from a clampdown on social media that we're seeing in some countries? I suppose in India is the latest example. So aside from the threat to the press, the threat to the social media companies.
I'll give you a very interesting and scary example. I think Brazil and India, maybe Pakistan, we are not usually seen as authoritarian, as having authoritarian governments. We're like big democracies who are undergoing an erosion of democracy, right? In India, we just saw the government trying to interfere with Twitter and all the platforms, telling them basically what they should and what they should not allow. In Brazil, there are 12 pieces of legislation in Congress and one presidential executive order about to be published that basically says that social media platforms are not allowed to moderate content, even when it's a risk to public health or if it's glorification of violence, like all the community rules that they have been enforcing lately. So if this executive order actually is approved or is not questioned, or the legislation, what we are seeing is next year, we could have, for instance, the president or some of his supporters going online on the social media platforms and telling people, elections are rigged. You should all go to voting polls, voting stations, and watch for any kind of frauds because they're under. I mean, they will be able to spread panic and to incite violence without being bothered. So on the one hand, of course, we see that social media platforms have a huge responsibility and they have not been very good at enforcing their own rules lately. However, the attempts of the government are also very concerning. It's interesting how we went from a position of telling the social media platforms, you're not enforcing enough the platforms, and we are seeing an erosion of democracy. And now we are seeing governments turning against social platforms and saying you have a bias against conservative governments, so you are censoring us, and we will find ways to prevent you from moderating content. So, difficult situation.
Your lecture's title was "How to Rescue Journalism in an Age of Lies," and I think you made a very persuasive case, which I guess not many people are going to disagree with who are listening, about the importance of journalism and the necessity of journalism. And you also made a very persuasive case about the things journalists should avoid. So, avoid activism, avoid telling people what to think. What do you think journalism has to do to raise its game to win that trust back from the people that it may have lost?
It's a very important and difficult question. I think we have a very important opportunity because we regained some of that lost trust. People started polls show that because of the pandemic and the way that, reporting, professional journalism was important for people to get that information, people started to value journalism again. So we should not waste this opportunity. And one of the things, first, I think we should be more careful than ever with mistakes and errors, because we have all these populist leaders. They are watching carefully the moment we're gonna make a mistake. So this is the one thing. We are always careful. That's part of the profession, right? But we should be more than ever. And we should not, some of the people that think that getting a piece of information or news from WhatsApp is the same thing as reading a newspaper or getting their information from a news program on TV, they think that everybody is equally biased. So that's why I think it's important that we make very clear the distinction between opinion and news reporting, and maybe even educate people. And that's something we have been trying. Because, no one has to know what's an analysis, what's an opinion, what's a news article. People are not supposed to know that, right? We're not supposed to know how doctors work, So we should be very transparent, showing people, okay, so this is a factual report of something that is happening. Of course, I'm not saying we're going to be impartial. That is a utopia. We all know that. But we're saying that at least we're trying to be balanced here, and we're not trying to make your mind or convince you of something. So I think one of the things we should really make efforts to keep this difference very clear and be very honest with the readers and people who are watching us, so that they can value and understand how a journalist works, how they get their information. You know, it's not like I'm here thinking in front of the computer and I just have an idea and I write it, right? Like that you obtain it from somewhere, and how different that is from an analysis or an opinion piece. I think that could help. But again, I understand many people are trying to answer this question. So,
yeah, that's a good answer. Okay, so I'm going to take some of the questions that are appearing in chat. So this is a question from a prominent Brazilian fact checker, Cristina Tardaguia. How can social media platforms improve the battle against mis and disinformation in Brazil? Is enforcing their own policies in the country the first step?
That's an excellent question from an excellent fact checker. Yes, what we have seen in Brazil and in many other countries is that they have different standards in enforcing their own rules. For instance, in Brazil, we had a report recently showing that President Jair Bolsonaro, he had violated Facebook COVID-19 community rules over 20 times in a month or 2 months because he does weekly lives on Facebook, and nothing happened. I mean, it was, you can read the community rules and you can see, you know, you're not supposed to tout unproven treatment. You're not supposed to say that masks don't work or to talk about unproven side effects of the vaccines. But still, this is exactly what the Brazilian leader, and I'm sure many other leaders around the world, are doing. And they're not being sanctioned in any way. They're not suffering any kind of sanction, or they're not getting labeled, or, you know, people are just getting this information unfiltered. So when you see social media platforms saying, you know, we are moderating, they don't say that, but they are moderating content. They are trying to, you know, enforce their own rules so that they avoid regulation from the government. They're not really doing this in a uniform way around the world. It's much more, they're much more strict enforcing their own rules in the US or in some European countries, because that's where everybody's watching. I mean, but there's a high political cost of enforcing their own rules against politicians, right? That's why they created the newsworthy exception. But you have to make sure these rules are going to be enforced in the same way everywhere.
The next question comes from a member of our steering committee here in Oxford, Gina Neff. She says, thanks for sharing your experience. Women journalists face a dual challenge on social media: the need for professional visibility versus the need for professional safety. What can news organizations do to support women in journalism?
Thank you very much for your question, Gina. It's interesting how a few years ago, this was a non-problem, as we say in Brazil. I mean, news organizations did not see this as a problem because we thought it was, you know, basically harmless, people just criticizing other people online. And we just saw that this was becoming more and more aggressive and was also migrating from the online world to the real world. And it does work as like a new form of censorship, because I'm sure every time you're about to write something or to publish an investigative piece that you know it's going to be viewed as negative by the government, you start thinking, okay, so where's the attack going to come from? You know, how should I prepare myself? These are the things we didn't learn at journalism school or during our careers. We're not supposed to think, we're supposed to think about, okay, so I have to check the information, get the sources, you know, listen to all sides involved, but do I have to stop and think, should I publish this? What's going to happen to my family? So one of the things that I think news organizations started to do is first acknowledge this is a problem, right? Because in the beginning, they just dismissed it. They said, well, you know, if you're on social media, people are sometimes a bit aggressive, and this is not what's happening. It's much worse. It's really works as an intimidation. So I think, first of all, news organizations should be willing to listen to journalists, especially female journalists, and also minority journalists who are the main targets, and try to help, even with mental health assistance and digital security assistance. How do you protect your social media accounts? So these things, starting with the acknowledgement that that's a real problem, could be some help.
I should say that our Brazilian fellow Adele asked a very similar question, so thank you very much. That answers her question too. Another steering committee member, Geert Linnebank, former editor-in-chief of Reuters. Can you tell us something about how journalism and or the news media are regulated in Brazil?
It's a complex question, but it is interesting. Well, we don't have an agency regulating media per se, it's not the authoritarian government model that you have official censorship. It is a democratic country with a free media ever since the end of the military dictatorship 40 years ago. So what we do have is regulation over advertisement, but you don't have government interfering directly with the media outlets. The tools they have to put pressure is, well, enacting legislation that basically affects revenues of the media outlets, which they have been trying to do in several ways. Cutting advertising, putting pressure on private advertisers. And in the case of TVs, the president has been threatening not to renew the license of the main TV station, Globo, just like what happened in the Philippines with the TV channel there. So they do have more sway over TVs because these are licenses. So that's basically how they can regulate. And of course, I mean, it's different for media outlets and social media platforms as it is in the US and many other countries. We are responsible for anything that is published, right? We are liable, whereas social media is not.
One of the things that I think is so valuable about the Reuters Institute is the way that journalists meet in Oxford and compare notes. And I think that inspires this question from our current Polish fellow, Jakub Krupa. Given that a lot of national leaders seem to follow more or less consciously some sort of handbook to crack down on free media, how much would it help if reporters and journalists from the affected countries collaborated more to make sure they know how to spot things, react to them, and work in a challenging environment?
I think that would be excellent, because I don't believe there's a conspiracy and there's someone, in a bunker just thinking, how are we going to spread the extreme right ideology around the world? But they do have some very similar playbooks. So it would be invaluable if we could learn from our, Hungarian colleagues, Indian colleagues, British colleagues, American colleagues, Latin American colleagues, everywhere, because there are some things that they're just repeating everywhere. I mean, of course, respecting some cultural aspects of each country, but it is very, the way, for instance, that they use fiscal policies or fiscal, that they try to persecute media outlets using as excuse tax evasion, for instance. This has been repeated in several countries. The way they put pressure on advertisers, and they first cut advertising, the way they're using national security laws to intimidate opposition and journalists, and the way that they're not doing this in Brazil yet, but that some countries are enacting fake news legislation that actually turns out to be against regular citizens just sharing information. So I do think it would be invaluable if we had like a forum where we could exchange views and sort of see, okay, so this is happening in XYZ countries. So maybe we should get prepared for that getting over here, because it is the same, a very similar playbook.
We're moving to Austria now. Our Austrian fellow, Elizabeth Gampel. Thank you so much for the talk. I have one question about platforms. The spread of misinformation and disinformation on Telegram or WhatsApp is alarming. Should newsrooms follow the people on these platforms and use chat apps and private networks to distribute news articles and to provide information, or is this a hopeless battle?
You mean, let me see if I understand. If we should use WhatsApp and Telegram to distribute like real news?
Well, I don't know if Elizabeth, you're there and you want to come in, but I take it that if you know the people who are responsible for spreading the misinformation, should news organizations make more of a conscious effort to target them? I suppose that's the question.
Yeah. Yes, this is a big dilemma. Of course, we know it's useless to try to know and find out who are the people sharing it. We have to find out the organizations who are sponsoring influence operations. You know, there's like, sometimes there are political groups that are sponsoring these influence operations. And this is what we have to investigate. However, we know that WhatsApp is encrypted, and it is a good thing because it basically protects privacy of, you know, activists and journalists and everyone in countries where otherwise we would be spied by the government. So we're not saying you have to break the encryption of WhatsApp, but it is complicated because how do you identify the origin of certain disinformation campaigns, who is sponsoring them? However, we have to say in Brazil, for instance, WhatsApp, after the lynchings in India and after 2018 election in Brazil, they did add lots of friction devices or tools that make it more difficult for this information to go viral. You cannot forward the message to so many people when it's going viral. So they're trying to do something to prevent this. But then you see, okay, so now people are migrating to Telegram. Telegram, like in Brazil, we don't even know who's Telegram in Brazil or in many other countries, and there are no limitations whatsoever. You have groups or channels with thousands of hundreds of thousands of people. For instance, I'll tell you, in Brazil, they have groups with like 200,000, 300,000 people discussing early treatment for COVID-19, which is basically unproven medicine. Or you have thousands of people in Telegram groups discussing how the election in 2022 will be fraudulent. And who do you talk to? I mean, it's really hard. It's difficult to investigate, mainly in messaging apps. In social media platforms, it's a bit easier, even regarding their influence on political operations or in elections. They're being more transparent. They have the ad libraries where you can see who's paying for which ads. So we have to put pressure on them to make them more and more transparent so that we can investigate and get to the origin, to the groups that are sponsoring these operations. Otherwise, you're going to end up having fake news legislation that basically criminalizes regular people.
Here's a question from our Hungarian fellow at the moment, Peter Adelyi. And he points out that some of your news organization is behind a paywall. There is a concern that the truth is moving increasingly behind paywalls while lies are remaining free. Do you understand this dynamic, and are you concerned about it? And how can reporters and newsrooms make sure their work reaches the widest possible audience while also finding sustainability? He ends up, who has to bear the costs of public service journalism?
Yes, absolutely. It is unfair competition. We're like, struggling and investigating and publishing, what we try to be accurate news articles, but they are behind a paywall. While this information just goes viral very fast, and you have activists like human rights activists saying, well, you have to put the stories out for free, but who's going to pay the salaries of the journalists? This is something that okay, so some media outlets in the US and other places, they're having other business models. They're getting foundations to sponsor them. They're getting membership. I would say that in Brazil, we're not there yet. We do have a few independent media outlets online that are self-financing or getting funding from foundations. But otherwise, if we don't get a way to finance or to make the business model profitable without subscriptions, there's no way we can abolish paywall. It's not sustainable. So every time we publish something and people say, oh, just, publish it for free, there's a paywall. I'm like, yes, but otherwise we're not getting paid.
Familiar dilemma. Here is a question from your fellow Brazilian journalist, Daniela Pinheiro, who's here in Oxford. Do you believe that the Brazilian press is prepared to cover next year's presidential elections when Bolsonaro will try everything to undermine even more the press and the democratic institutions? And if you do believe they're prepared, why do you believe they're prepared?
I don't think we are prepared. Well, thank you, Daniela, for your question. I don't think we're prepared. I don't think social media platforms are prepared. And I'm really worried it's going to be chaos. Basically, regarding Brazilian media, we don't know how we're going to avoid amplifying just the same mistake we made in 2018, the same mistake the US made, some US journalists made in 2016. We're just going to be used as loudspeaker for politicians who are extremists and who are trying to mold the news cycle or to manipulate the news cycle. And we end up just helping them. I don't think we know that. We're also not prepared to the lack of transparency. One of the things that's become worse in Brazil is that we have our Freedom of Information Act here, and it's getting more and more difficult to access information through this because the government is denying those requests. In terms of the social media platforms, I asked several of them, like, how are you prepared? Do you have a war room? How are you going to deal with this massive amount of disinformation regarding rigged elections? And they're like, oh, we're not thinking about this yet. We are thinking, but we don't have a war room. We don't have a situation room. And I'm scared that we're all watching a catastrophe to unfold before our eyes, not doing anything, right? I think we should urgently be thinking about how to prepare, how to not to make mistakes, how to access information, and how to try to bring some not peace, but some stability, because the information environment, it's going to be so chaotic next year. Otherwise, we're going to end up with even more fractured country. There's a reality dissociation. People are just living in two separate worlds.
Here, question from Christine, our Indonesian fellow. How do you gain trust in news if the audience mostly consumes social media and not read news at all? Does it mean that news outlets should be more prominent on social media, which now seems to be the battleground for fighting misinformation?
Thank you, Christina, for your question. I do think we need to be more active. And I do think sometimes traditional media have this prejudice against technologies still, which is, it's really unbelievable that at this point, but they're slowly, gradually adapting to it. But some of the initiatives we are seeing, for instance, in Brazil, there was a very important initiative, which is a consortium among of several media outlets that they were getting original statistics of COVID-19 deaths and infections from the state secretaries of health. In Brazil last year, the government started hiding COVID-19 figures. They would just publish people who were cured and not people who died of the disease. And then right after that, the Ministry of Health said, we are getting a new statistics model, which would basically omit part of the figures. So media outlets got together and they started getting their information directly from the state level secretaries about all the COVID-19 figures. And I think this is the kind of work that shows the importance of journalism, of someone, getting the information and getting it out there. But as Christina said, it is, we don't know if people are ever good, if this information is ever going to reach people, right? Because social media reaches people so much more easier. So I guess we have to combine even more investing in trustworthiness and transparency in reporting, but not avoiding technology or better ways to reach people.
We're getting to the end of the session. So just a couple more questions. One is from Bamet, who's our Kyrgyzstan fellow. And the question is following on from what you said about Telegram groups and how much more difficult it's become to investigate disinformation on messaging apps. Based on the worrying trend and your past experience in covering the elections, do you plan to change your approach to covering the upcoming elections? Have you got any new tools or techniques that you want to adopt to face these new challenges?
Sorry, I missed the beginning of your question because I was having some audio issues.
Okay.
Can you repeat the beginning of the question? Sorry.
The question was just from what you have been saying about Telegram groups, how much more difficult it's become to investigate disinformation. Really, as you think about the next election, are you going to change your approach and whether you've got any new tools or techniques?
Yes, I think we're going to invest more in digital forensics, sort of. We were only covering disinformation, political disinformation in a very reactive way, instead of really investigating, who's paying for that, where is it coming from, but that needs cooperation from the social media platforms. And I think there is a realization now about the importance of this. So one of the aspects that's going to be important in 2022 is, again, disinformation, and we're going to be more proactive investigating these things, not just, reactively trying to combat or just fact check, which is really important. But I mean, we have to go beyond that. This is one of the things. And the other thing is that we hope we don't repeat the mistakes we made last election, in terms of just following the script of the politicians. We were, again, very reactive and only covering he said, she said, instead of getting into the thick of things.
Final question from me, Patrícia, then we'll let you go. And it's really about how much you feel supported in the rest of the world. I guess in the English language, people are very visible, and there's a huge community of English language journalists that can see what's going on. I'm wondering how it feels in Brazil with the Portuguese language, whether you feel that the rest of the world is less appreciative of the problems that you're suffering, or that you feel the community of journalists is less engaged. Can you talk a little about how that feels?
If they're less engaged with the issues in Brazil,
I just think if I mean, everyone knows about the problems of the press with Trump. That was a very visible story, and I guess to some extent, but I mean, Portuguese is a very big language, but it's not a kind of universal language like English. And I wonder if that leads to feeling a bit more sort of cut off from, and maybe gives the politicians more license to do bad things because they think, well, people are not going to be watching.
Absolutely. I mean, we are, after all, invisible. Why would you be reading every single new outrageous statement or measure of the Brazilian president, which is just one among several authoritarian populists all over the world? I remember in 2019, we got the Committee to Protect Journalists award, the Freedom of the Press award. And there were three of us, Neha Dixit from India, there was a colleague from Pakistan, and me, and we started telling people, I mean, it was part of the advocacy part of the award, how things were in Pakistan, Brazil, and India. And of course, people had no idea, including the then Vice President Mike Pence, because why would they, right? I mean, even India, they have English language newspapers and people speak English, and Pakistan a bit, but still, first, people are not used to seeing these countries as, gradually having a gradual erosion of the democratic system. And second, people are so focused on the US or in Europe, which is really important, that of course they don't know. And so it is a bit difficult to gain visibility to the problems and including the press problems. Although I think people are more aware right now of the importance, and they are paying attention to countries that were just, plain classic democracies a few years ago and no longer are, say, Hungary, Turkey, other countries.
Patrícia, we said we'd let you go in an hour. When you got your CPJ award in 2019, someone said that if they were going to sum you up in one word, it would be fearless. I think we've had a sense of that tonight. It's been as I said, a sobering but gripping talk about the necessity of journalism and the sense that it is only journalism that stands between us and the chaos that is out there in the world of information. You're coming up to a very important election. Your work is ever more important, and you've made such a compelling case tonight for it. So thank you for giving up your time and for coming along tonight. And we wish you all the best. And we send our thanks for such a brilliant lecture tonight. Thank you. And thank you, everybody, for coming along and listening.